Hey everyone, Cool Kid here. If you ask me, augments are one of Warframe's most interesting ideas, mods that fundamentally alter how a specific ability functions. They not only change how an ability works, but how the player approaches the use of that ability, and where said ability fits into the frame's kit and gameplay loop. While this all sounds great on paper, I will admit that my description is an idealized version of the system. While many augments do live up to this ideal, there are also many that fall short of it. So, in today's video, we're going to talk about the different types of augment mods, what works well, and what issues they can present. I do want to mention that this video is going to focus primarily on Warframe augments, but we will briefly touch on weapon augments near the end. When it comes to talking about augments, I find there to be 5 categories that I place them into. These aren't strict categories around things like damage, healing, or anything like that, but instead categories that classify both the usefulness and design of the augments within them. To explain what I mean, let's start with the first category, which I'm calling good. This category is for augments that meet the previously outlined ideal. They alter their respective ability in a substantial way, changing its relationship with the rest of the Warframe's kit. In a way, these augments often feel like entirely new abilities or reimaginings of existing ones. One of my favorite examples for this category is Cataclysmic Gate, the augment for Wisp's Soulgate ability. This augment changes Wisp's 4th ability from a channeled laser to a set-and-forget fireball that radiates damage. This changes the ability from something that Wisp herself has to actively maintain to something that she can deploy in a choke point or group of enemies before resuming her normal gameplay, which is a big shakeup to how Soulgate normally works. Even better, this augment still adheres to all of the rules that Soulgate normally has. Enemies still take escalating damage the more they're hit by the ability, Surge Sparks from Breach Surge are still guaranteed on every tick of damage, Vitality and Shock Mote still boost the damage by 25% each, and the Haste Mote still applies corrosive procs on damage ticks. All of the knowledge a player has learned from the regular version of Soulgate still applies to Cataclysmic Gate, but now with a new context. Another example I want to highlight is Coil Recharge, which is an augment for Gyre's 2nd ability, Coil Horizon. Normally, Coil Horizon is a pretty simple ability. Gyre throws out a large ball, and after a brief delay, it detonates, pulling in nearby enemies and inflicting them with the electric status. Coil Recharge doesn't alter this basic functionality too much, but now the ball is active for much longer, and it takes on a new role as a bowling ball. While active, the ball can be recalled by pressing the ability key again, and melee strikes will send it flying in the direction the player is looking. Enemies hit by the ball will be zapped, and the further the ball travels, the lower the cooldown on its zap. If the player wants to end the bowling session early, they can hold the ability key to collapse the ball into a vortex like normal, though this time it will also cause additional electrical discharges. Like with Cataclysmic Gate, this augment completely changes how Coil Horizon fits into Gyre's kit, going from a simple grouping ability to a source of arcing damage. It also still obeys all of Gyre's overarching logic. It gets critical chance from Cathode Grace, critical hits from the Sphere will cause discharges from Rotor Swell, all of the conventional Gyre knowledge still applies. The last augment I want to highlight for this category is Enraged, which augments Valkyr's 4th ability, Hysteria. This augment changes Hysteria from a channeled ability to a duration-based ability, with a base duration of 15 seconds. Hysteria also receives a matching cooldown based on how long you were using the ability for, so if you were in Hysteria for, say, 7 seconds, then you'd receive a 7-second cooldown when the ability ends. In exchange for this cooldown, Hysteria gets a 350% boost to both damage and critical chance, with both of these bonuses being additive with mods. While I don't think the raw power of this mod is as impressive as it used to be now that Valkyr's been reworked, it still does a great job of changing Hysteria's relationship with Valkyr's wider gameplay loop. Instead of trying to remain in Hysteria at all times, this augment makes the ability more of a moment of power. If you find that you prefer to use your other weapons when playing Valkyr, then this augment can be great for briefly dipping into Hysteria to blow up a powerful target, like an Acolyte or Necromech. This augment is admittedly pretty niche, but the way it changes Hysteria's role in Valkyr's kit makes it an augment that I find to be well designed. Okay, I think that's enough examples for you to get the point. Now let's move on to the next category, which I'm calling Mid. Augments can fit in the Mid category for 2 reasons. First, they do provide a useful benefit, but they don't really change the abilities they augment that much, often just being straight upgrades. Now, to make something clear, I do think that augments should be an upgrade on some level, because they take up a mod slot. But having a mod provide a numerical increase and nothing more is just kind of boring, and we can see that with our first example, Eternal War. This augment makes Warcry's duration increase by 2 seconds for each melee kill the caster gets, which is a solid buff, but it doesn't really change how the ability fits into the kit. Instead of breathing some new life or function into Warcry, this augment just makes it so you don't have to cast it as often. It's certainly a buff, sure, but it doesn't feel very inspired. This augment is a solid option for a build. I even use it on several of mine, but the design of it just isn't that interesting. The second reason an augment would find itself in the mid category is if it provides a unique bonus that just isn't that strong. Sure, it may alter how the ability works within the kit, but if the bonus it provides isn't that good, then there's often not a huge reason to sacrifice the mod slot for it. Take, for example, Immolated Radiance, an augment for Ember's Immolation. This augment grants nearby allies half of Ember's own damage reduction, which sounds pretty good up front. This augment changes Immolation to more of a support ability, which does alter how it's used in the kit, but the bonus it provides just isn't very good. Because the maximum amount of damage reduction that Ember can get is 90%, the maximum she can provide to allies is 45%. I go into more depth about this concept in my video Is DR Dead, but to summarize why this is bad, 90% damage reduction is a 10 times increase in effective health, as you're only taking 10% of the damage that hits you. 45% damage reduction is less than a 2 times effective health multiplier, because you'll still be taking 55% of the damage that hits you. Even though this augment does change Immolation to fit into a more supportive role, the buff it provides is so weak that it's not super useful outside of some niche setups. Our final category of augment is what I'm calling weak, and it's for augments that provide bonuses that generally aren't worth taking. These augments are, quite simply, just too underpowered to provide much benefit outside of very specific loadouts tailored around said augment. Take, for example, Chroma's Afterburn, which charges up a projectile while his Spectral Scream is active. This projectile builds 100 damage per second up to 500 damage, and it's launched once the ability is deactivated. This augment just doesn't deal enough damage to actually matter, and it also doesn't alter Spectral Scream in any way that feels unique. In fairness, this was originally a Conclave augment, but so was Double Tap, and that mod is insanely good. For some reason, Afterburn just didn't receive any buffs when it was brought over to the PvE side of the game, and it shows. Another augment with questionable usability is Savior Decoy, an augment for Loki's first ability. This augment makes it so that, if Loki dies, the decoy absorbs the fatal damage and swaps places with Loki. It also provides a bump in casting speed for Decoy, I guess. Now, you absolutely can make this augment work, and it does absolutely change how Decoy fits into Loki's kit, but if you ask me, it's just mired with problems. For one, Loki is going to be invisible much of the time, so the risk of him dying is already fairly low. 2, Decoy is made to draw enemy fire, so it's very possible that the Decoy will die before Loki takes fatal damage. 3, because Decoy is made to draw enemy fire, if Loki dies, then he'll be placed in the middle of a bunch of enemies that were just attacking his Decoy. Now, he does get 3 seconds of invincibility when he switches, which is a silver lining, but all of these factors together just make this augment exceedingly niche if you ask me. Combine that with the fact that Loki already has a very good invincibility augment in Safeguard Switch, and the fact that this augment prevents you from using Damage Decoy, and there just isn't much reason to run it. I also want to briefly highlight that Deceptive Bond is an augment that's honestly even worse than Savior Decoy, but I didn't want to use 2 former Conclave augments in a row because that kinda felt like cheating. Okay, so those are the 3 basic categories. Good for augments that live up to the ideal of being both kit-altering and worth using, mid for augments that are either boring upgrades or lackluster gimmicks, and weak for augments that have too many flaws to be worth using most of the time. I do want to point out that these aren't set-in-stone categories, and you can absolutely argue augments up or down in placement. The goal with these categories is to give us an easy framework to evaluate augment mods, but where any given mod is placed within that framework is up to one's own interpretation. I'm also not going to cover every single augment mod and where I'd put them within the system because that would be a massive waste of time. With that out of the way, I want to talk about the last 2 categories for augments that are both somewhat connected: Band-Aid augments and mandatory augments. These are very similar categories, but they mostly differ depending on the reason you're actually using an augment. Let's start with Band-Aids, which is a category that I'm sure many of you are already familiar with. Band-Aid augments are mods that you typically equip because they fix a hole in the Warframe's base kit. In most cases, these augments should just be part of the base kit, but for some reason, you're made to sacrifice a mod slot for what feels like basic functionality. I find one of the most egregious examples of this to be Energy Transfer, which is an augment for Equinox's 4th abilities, Mend and Maim. This augment makes it so that the charge built up in one form is saved when transferring into the other form, so Maim's charge will be converted into Mend's charge when going from day to night form, and vice versa. This augment was functionality that Equinox players had been asking for, but as part of the base kit, not as a mod. Equinox already has very little reason to switch between forms, and not dispelling all of her abilities when she switched seemed like something the base kit was lacking. Not only does Energy Transfer only affect one of her abilities, but you also have to give up a mod slot to run it, so you lose out on the potential of a better mod that you could have put in its place. This augment is only really useful if you're trying to swap between forms on Equinox, but in her current state, there's just not much of a reason to do that. Typically you'll build for one form and stay in that form constantly, and while this augment may make moving between forms smoother, it's not helpful enough to justify the mod slot. On the other side of the coin, we have a Band-Aid mod that patches a hole in its frames kit, but that hole is so big without said augment that you kind of have to run it. My prime example for this phenomenon is Omakuji's Fortune, an augment for Komei's 2nd ability. This mod makes it so that kills with the weapon matching Komei's passive will reduce the cooldown between her Omakuji challenges by 4 seconds. Now, Omakuji's decrees are the most powerful aspect of Komei's kit, but a major point of friction for many players is how long they take to get. Once the cooldown is at max, you have to wait 2.5 minutes between challenges, which makes getting new decrees a chore. Without Omakuji's Fortune, getting every decree on Kome takes over 6 hours, but with the Augment, that time goes down massively. I've been able to get every decree in about 3 hours with this Augment, though others have been able to do it in about 2.5. That's a 2 to 3 times increase in the amount of decrees you can get in a given length of time, which is insanely strong. Like Energy Transfer, this Augment feels like it was made to band-aid a major friction in the Frames kit, though unlike Energy Transfer, the issue that Omakuji's Fortune fixes is so vast that it feels like you have to take it. Now, before I move on, I want to talk about a kind of subcategory within the band-aid mods, which I'm calling feel-based mods. I know that sounds weird, but these are augments that alter the feel of a Warframe, normally by taking away a passive mechanic. These augments in particular are Controlled Slide, Anchored Glide, and Warrior's Rest, which all disable passive components of their respective Warframes in exchange for a 15% power strength increase. I guess there's also Ironclad Flight, but nobody uses that shit. These mods are interesting to me, because whether or not they're a band-aid will vary from player to player. I personally really like Nezha's Slide passive, and I can tolerate Zephyr's Reduced Gravity, so their augments don't have much value to me. I do know many people who don't like those mechanics though, and having an option to turn them off is actually pretty valuable, especially with these only being Exilus mods. I also want to fit Mesa's Waltz into this category, as while it doesn't provide any crazy buff to the regulators, it does improve the feel for those who find the rigid nature of Peacemaker uncomfortable. Now, while I never thought I'd do this, I need to stick up for Umbra's Sentience passive, which is disabled by Warrior's Rest. I personally find this passive to be super annoying, so I always take Warrior's Rest to turn it off, but I've seen a lot of people say that this mod's existence proves that DE would rather band-aid over something than actually fix it. The thing is, a lot of Umbral Sentience's issues have been fixed. Namely, Umbra doesn't dispel Exalted Blade whenever you enter your operator anymore, and he no longer gets rid of buffs like Furious Javelin either. He does still have his issues, like turning off subsumed channeled abilities like Gloom, but it's not like DE has never made any effort to improve the passive. He does still love to run off and get himself killed though, so I don't much like him. I know this is a bit of a tangent, but as much as I hate this passive, I feel like the misinformation about it deserves to be corrected. Alright, now on to the final category, Mandatory Augments. These are kind of similar to Band-Aid Augments, but with a major difference. These augments don't patch a hole in a Frames kit, but rather, they're so incredibly strong that you basically have to take them. My first example of this type of augment is one of the most overwhelming, Cathode Current, which is technically an augment for Cathode Grace, but really it's an augment for Rotor Swell. This augment makes it so that, if an enemy is killed while both Cathode Grace and Rotor Swell are active, then Gyre herself will release a lightning bolt that deals 200% more damage than normal. Rotor Swell will also have its duration increased by the same amount as Cathode Grace on kills. This augment is insanely good, as it both gives Gyre a huge increase in damage and also massively improves her energy economy by removing the need to recast Rotor Swell. Rotor Swell is by no means a bad ability without Cathode Current, and Cathode Grace isn't a bad ability either, but this augment is just so strong that you kind of have to take it. I've seen many people call mods like Cathode Current band-aids, and I want to clarify again that, as I see it at least, band-aid mods add a functionality that should be in the base kit by default, while mandatory augments make already good abilities so much better that they feel needed. As another example, let's look at Reactive Storm, which augments Baruch's fourth ability, Serene Storm. This augment grants Desert Wind a whopping 250% increase in status chance, which is both additive with status chance mods and scales with power strength. In addition, Reactive Storm will change the base impact damage of Desert Wind to match the weaknesses of whatever enemy it's hitting. This typically prioritizes combo elements, then primary elements, then physical damage, and it'll show on screen what element gets picked for each faction. Like with Rotor Swell, Desert Wind is by no means a bad exalted weapon on its own, but this augment is just so good that you kind of have to take it if you're playing around Serene Storm. The 250% status chance is monstrous enough by itself, and because it scales with strength mods, you can very easily hit 100% status chance on Desert Wind. This opens up a lot of builds that are much more inconsistent on the normal Desert Wind, like scoring a billion blast procs with melee afflictions. The adapting damage also means that your innate impact damage will be converted into a damage type that deals 50% more damage to a given faction, which is a sizable damage boost for free. That's not even considering the utility of things like having Corrosive against the Grenier or Magnetic against the Corpus on demand. Again, this augment doesn't really patch any holes in Baruch's kit, but it's just way too good to pass up. The last example I want to point to in this category is Intrepid Stand, which augments Styanax's fourth ability. This augment makes it so that each spear hit grants Styanax 60 Overguard and his allies 30 Overguard, up to a cap of 15,000 Overguard. The amount of Overguard scored per spear is also affected by strength mods, so reaching the 15,000 cap is typically pretty quick. What makes this augment mandatory, aside from just being extremely good, is that it removed what was Styanax's only real weakness. Now, that may sound like a band-aid mod when I put it that way, but I think that Warframe should have some weaknesses so that they can't do everything by themselves. For Styanax, his main weakness was that his 4 made him a huge target, so if he wasn't getting kills fast enough, he could easily die even through rally point shield generation. With this augment, Styanax is functionally immortal, on top of having infinite energy from rally point. The Overguard also protects his shield pool from damage, allowing him to maintain the maximum amount of critical chance from his passive at all times, and maintaining his shield gate in the event that his Overguard does break. This augment took away the one thing that could actually threaten Styanax, making him go from a solid pick to an S-tier Warframe overnight. He has a defense strip, crit boosting, energy generation, Overguard, and a 4 that functionally fires 70 Exceltra rockets wherever he's looking. Styanax's kit played just fine before this augment got added, but with it he has virtually no weaknesses, so taking it is a no-brainer. Okay, so I've explained the characteristics of both band-aid and mandatory augments, as well as their differences. Something I have yet to explain, though, is why they're actually a problem. As I see it, these augments limit build variety by feeling like they're needed, either because they fix up a frame's base kit, or make an ability so much better that you just have to take it. This means that at least one mod slot in your build is basically always reserved for an augment, which limits how much you can actually change your build. It also makes other augments struggle to get slotted, as most frames typically have a suite of mods that need to be slotted in first to get their kit moving. If a frame also has a mandatory augment, then often your only option to fit in any other augment mod is to drop a mod that's crucial to your build. While augments at their core are supposed to widen both build and playstyle diversity, mandatory and band-aid mods instead limit it by working their way into virtually every build. So, how do we go about fixing this problem? Well, for the band-aid mods, it's pretty simple. Most, if not all of them, should just become part of the base kit. DE has even done this several times before, so it's not out of the question. For example, Inaros' Scarab Shell ability used to have an augment called Negation Swarm, which would block status effects in exchange for 3% of the bonus armor that the ability provided. With Inaros' rework in Dante Unbound, this became a base function of the ability, and Inaros was instead given the Negation Armor augment to replace it. Similarly, Hydroid used to have an augment for Tempest Barrage called Corroding Barrage, which gave the ability corrosive procs. This was also rolled into the base ability when Hydroid got his rework in Abyss of Daggeth, with the new Viral Tempest augment replacing it and inflicting viral procs instead. Most recently, Ash's teleport ability was merged with Fatal Teleport, an augment that forced finishers on enemies and massively boosted finisher damage. Now, the ability has Teleport Rush as its augment, which boosts parkour velocity and increases Smokescreen's duration on finisher kills. So there is precedent for this kind of change, but you might have noticed a little hang-up that I kinda glossed over. All of these changes came with full-on reworks to their respective warframes. While it's not super uncommon for DE to roll a band-aid augment into the base kit, it is quite uncommon for them to do it without a rework. In fact, the last time I can even think of them buffing an ability on an old frame that didn't get reworked was Hildren. When the Aegis Gale augment came out in Kome and the Five Fates, DE made several improvements to her Aegis Storm ability, making it far more usable even without the augment. I don't think that DE doing stuff like this again is out of the question, but it's certainly not something they do frequently. Honestly, I'd be down for an update where a bunch of band-aid mods would get rolled into their base abilities, and we'd then get a batch of new augments for the same abilities that feel more in line with the goals of the system. Will this ever happen? Probably not, but I can dream. As for mandatory augments, I think that's a much trickier thing to handle. If we were to just roll them into the base kit, then that would solve the problem of limiting build variety, but it would also massively increase the base power level of any warframes that get that treatment. I've seen many people ask for a mod slot dedicated purely to augments, but I also don't know if that's a good solution. It does free up your other mod slots, sure, but it doesn't really fix the problem of the mods feeling mandatory. All we're really doing with this solution is just putting the mandatory augment somewhere else, but it's still going to eat up capacity in every build and block other augments from living in that slot. At that point, I feel like we'd just be reinforcing the problem instead of fixing it, as we'd make it easier than ever to design band-aid or mandatory mods, because we'd have the justification that they can just live in the augment slot. I also feel like, while no augment mod should ever be required, at the same time, augments should be an upgrade in some sense. Augments prevent you from slotting something in their place in exchange for new functionality, so they should naturally be improvements. The problem with mandatory mods is that they're too good to pass up, but if we add an augment slot, then there would be no downside to taking an augment on frames that don't have mandatory mods. At that point, the base kit may as well not exist, which would then likely feed into augments being used as a way to balance warframes instead of actual direct buffs. I guess we could also nerf the mandatory mods to bring them back in line with the rest of the augments, but I really don't like that idea. So, how do we fix the problem of mandatory augments? If incorporating them into the base kit makes the base kit too strong, and adding an augment slot doesn't really address the root problem, then what do we do? Honestly, I don't really know. We should try to avoid the creation of mandatory augments in the future, obviously, but I don't know how we'd go about fixing the existing ones. This is where I'm going to turn to you all. What ideas do you have for addressing this issue, if you find it to be an issue at all? Do you think incorporating them into the base kit would be a good solution because you have to run them anyways? Or maybe you find that the benefits of an augment slot outweigh the potential negatives? I feel like this is a tough situation for the developers to get out of, and I'm curious what you all will offer as workable solutions. I know that not offering up a solution myself makes my feedback kinda shallow, but I don't want to make any suggestions that I'm not confident in. Also, real quick, I want to touch on augments that I put in the weak category. While both good and mid are categories that I think are fine as is, pretty much every augment in the weak category deserves to be buffed or full-on reworked. Fortunately, there aren't a ton of augments that are so weak they're hardly usable, but in a similar vein to the Band-Aid mods, I'd be down to see an update where a bunch of weak augments get buffed instead of us getting brand new ones. We've actually seen this kind of thing before, as the augment audit from a couple years ago buffed several weaker augments, like Ballistic Bullseye for example. There aren't really many augments left in the weak category, so it could be nice to get one more pass to lift the remaining augments up into at least the mid category. I also want to quickly touch on weapon augments, as I've been ignoring them for basically the entire video. These operate similarly to Warframe augments, with good ones offering a new way to use the weapon, mid ones offering straight up buffs, and weak ones not really being worth using, alongside Band-Aid augments that are required to make guns worth using, and mandatory augments that are just too good to pass up. Basically all of the same rationale I used for Warframe augments applies to weapon augments, but I feel like the issues presented by the way certain augments are designed are much more prevalent on Warframes. These could certainly warrant a future discussion if there's interest, but I didn't want this video to go too outside of its original scope. Alright, that's all for today's video. I'm sorry that I don't have a more satisfying conclusion when it comes to what to do about mandatory augments, but I'm very interested in the ideas that you all put forward. It's a tricky problem without a clear solution, so my hope is that we can synthesize some kind of action to take. Obviously, I don't expect the devs to ever see this, but hey, it's fun to talk about at least. Regardless, thank you very much for making it to the end of this video. If you enjoyed, feel free to leave a like, and if you want to see more garbage, then go ahead and subscribe. If you think this video is dog shit and that I should be placed in the femur breaker, then you're welcome to leave a dislike too. You can also join the Discord using the link in the description, and I posted plenty of other stuff on this channel, so if you liked this video, then maybe you'll like some of my others. Lastly, I want to give a massive thank you to all of my channel members for making these videos possible. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you all next time.